Boxing fans, what do you say? What do you know? What are you doing? Old school saying here. Back for another little bit of session here, where I want to try to impart a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of education on some of the confusion that's taking place today. I like to kind of peruse the boxing sites and listen to what other people who have boxing channels have to say about what's happening in the sport of boxing today. And as an old time, I kind of listen to this stuff, and my head goes in. I'll be honest with you, my head goes in circles. It's like you need a damn PhD to be able to figure out who the champions are today. So I hear discussions taking place today that you really, back in the day, you didn't really hear too much. It wasn't too much of a question about who's the best. I mean, the whole idea of having a world championship is so that you have an undisputed guy who you know is the best in the world, okay? You don't have that today. You have all sorts of confusion, and I'm going on these sites, and I'm seeing a lot of particularly younger guys, who I assume think that this is like the norm. This is the way it is. You got the different titles, you got the different weight classes, and the champion is really is determined on these forums where you argue about who's the best, who's fighting who's got the undefeated record, what promoter is promoting this type of fighter, blah blah blah. And it's crazy. It's a bunch of, to me, it destroys the spot. You don't see it happening in MMA. You don't see it happening in other combat sports like wrestling. World champion in wrestler or the Olympic champ, that guy's the best guy. There's just no doubt about it, because there's no BS. There's no, you don't have multiple divisions and multiple championships and whatnot. So what I want to do with this video is I want to try to impart a little bit of knowledge about how we got to where we are today, okay? And how it really doesn't have to be this way, how the business of boxing has really destroyed boxing. So I'm going to go back in history. Now, I'm using this 63-year-old freaking brain here to try to remember, when I was a kid, I was fanatical about the sport and really studied the history and whatnot. So I'm going back into the recesses of my mind for some of this stuff. Now, boxing really started. People don't realize. Everybody thinks, John L. Sullivan, the first. Boxing started in the 1700s in Britain. It was absolutely brutal. There was really no organization to it, and the sport was insane. You come into the pre-modern era, and I call the pre-modern era from 1880 to 1920. Okay, and basically what you had 8 weight divisions. You had the heavyweight division, you had the light heavyweight division, you had the middleweight division, you had the welterweight division, the lightweight division, the featherweight division, the bantamweight division, and the flyweight division. Those were your 8 weight classes. Okay. Now from 1880 to 1920, you didn't have formal sanctioning bodies. What you had was what were referred to as consensus champions. So you had a combination of the writers, the promoters, and the general public who recognized one guy as the champion in a particular division. Now, we refer to them as the consensus champion, or the term that you've heard today is, like they say, Tyson Fury is the lineal champion. When they say the lineal champion, all they mean is the guy who beat the guy. Okay? So back in the day, there was some degree of legitimacy. Now, I got to be very, very clear about this. While there was much more clarity back in the day about who the champion was, you had, like everything else in our society, in our world, you had a great degree of prejudice and particularly racism back in the day, so that the great black fighters did not have the opportunity to fight for a lot of the belts, particularly the heavyweight belt. I could do a video on this alone, but you had guys in the heavyweight division, Willis, Langford, McVeigh, Josephson, who were tremendous fighters who never got a chance to fight for the title. So you did have clarity in terms of number of divisions and lineal champion, but you did not have the best guys. You did not have the best guys fighting, and that's a reality that's got to be acknowledged. But in terms of structure, organizational structure, it was much tighter. In 1920. A lot of people don't know this. A lot of people know about the New York State Athletic Commission. I'm from New York City, so I kind of grew up with it. But people don't realize that boxing was banned in New York State from 1917 to 1920. The New York Boxing Commission was formed in order to bring some kind of safety and clarity to the game, and they did to a certain extent. The 15 round bout limit was actually instituted by the New York State Athletic Commission. In 1920, people don't realize this also. They formulated 9 additional weight classes, the junior weight classes. Now, they didn't do super, everything was junior. So it was, junior middleweight, junior welterweight, so forth and so on. So you did have the additional weight classes spring up in the 1920s, actually 1920. With the Walker Law. The Walker Law brought the New York State Athletic Commission into being, okay, because of the uproar about the deaths in the boxing game, and there were a lot of deaths in the boxing game back in the day. In fact, there are more today than you know about. A lot of them don't get publicized, but back in the day, it was rampant. So you have the New York State Athletic Commission. New York State Athletic Commission recognizes the champion of the world. Now, I mentioned about those junior divisions being formed. They were formed in 1920 by the New York State Athletic Commission, but they were not widely recognized until the 1960s, and some of them not until the 1980s. If you actually go through the history books, you'll see, yeah, you did. If you want to go back and you want to look at the junior welterweight champion, you'll find that, from 1920 to 1960, there were a handful of guys who held the title, but it was not widely recognized. That's why you had guys like, name anybody that you want from, like, let's say the 40s or the 30s. You didn't have Sugar Robinson fighting for the welterweight title, and then the junior middleweight, and then the middleweight. And then the junior light heavyweight, it just didn't exist. Okay, those weight classes were not widely recognized. So you had the New York State Athletic Commission in 1920. In 1921, you had the formation of the NBA, the National Boxing Association. Now, the National Boxing Association. So now you actually have 2 bodies. They were more rating bodies than sanctioning bodies. Okay. And what happened was, these two, for the most part, if you actually track the champions through history from 1921 on, where you have the 2 sanctioning bodies, the 2 bodies are 2 rating bodies. Let me say, not sanctioning. 2 rating bodies are pretty much in lockstep, along the way. They basically the agreement about who the champion is, and it's because you don't have the array of financial relationships that you have today in the boxing game with the 4 main bodies, and I'll get into that. But you didn't have that so much back in the day. So there are a couple exceptions. The NBA and the New York State Athletic Commission did not do a good job of recognizing Europe and European fighters. So basically in Europe, you had the EBU, the European Boxing Union, which was formed, and they had their own champions. But again, it was the same sort of situation where you had the 3 bodies who were pretty much in lockstep. Now, there were exceptions. I'll talk a little bit about one of the big exceptions. What would happen is you would have some confusion if you had a champion who was recognized by all the bodies as a champion, which was, as I said, the norm, who would retire. Then there was kind of a scramble for who was going to be, who was going to take the vacated title. So you would have some disruptions in terms of who the champ was when that happened. One particular instance where that really got a little bit crazy was between 1931 and 1941, when Mickey Walker vacated the middleweight title to fight as a heavyweight. From 1931 to 1941, you actually had a split about who the champion was. And the WBA and the New York State Athletic Commission and the European Boxing Union, were not in agreement about who the champ was. So you actually had multiple champs in that 10-year period. In fact, in 1941, for the first time in boxing, you had the term undisputed champ used. Okay, the undisputed champ was crowned where you basically had the 3 organizations come back into alignment after. I believe it was Tony Zale beat Georgie Abrams for the middleweight title. One was the New York State Athletic Commission guy. The other guy was an NBA guy. But after Zale won the title, the division was brought back to back to normal. So anyway, so for the most part, the picture here is multiple rating bodies who are basically in line with each other. 8 weight classes with some exception where you do have some of the junior, you do have some of the junior champions, but they were not widely recognized. And as I said, if you go back into the record book and you track one of those titles, let's say the junior welterweight title, you track that from 1920 on to 1960 or 1970, you see there were very, very few fights that took place relative to the other divisions where you actually had a champion crown. So you basically had the eight champions and a unified sanctioning body. Europe was kind of out there because again there was resistance and there was some anxiety over the fact that the NBA and the New York State Athletic Commission were really pro-American all the way. I mean, they definitely leaned toward the American fighters. And you know what? The American fighters were the better fighters, so it didn't matter too much. You did have your exceptions. You had your Marcel Sedans, who were great, great fighters. But Sedan was recognized as a middleweight champion across the board because he brought the goods. He was a great fighter. So in 1962, I think, I know it's the 1960s, basically had the New York State Athletic Commission morph into the WBA, and you have New York State Athletic Commission morphed into the WBC. The NBA morphs into the WBA. And I believe, I'm not sure whether these are flipped or not, but you basically have the NBA and the European Union kind of join forces together, and so the Europeans are now brought into the picture in the WBA. But again, you still have a large degree of continuity in the fight game in terms of the championships. Now, what starts happening is the junior divisions start one by one getting recognized on a wider basis. So if you actually look at that history, you'll see once you get into the 1960s, now you see more championship fights taking place at those divisions. In the 1980s, it blows up. 1983, I think, and 1988, you got the WBO and the IBF created. I'm not sure which one, what the years were, but you had those two bodies that were actually created. And now you got all hell breaks loose because you have all the junior divisions become recognized because now you have these organizations sanctioning fights and having their own champions, and it becomes much more of a moolah game. So the more championship divisions that you recognize, the more sanctioned title bouts that you hold, the more money that you make. So it becomes like everything else. Money is at the root of all evil. So here's the picture. In the old day, you go from eight divisions, 8 champions, okay, with some exception. Now you come into the modern era, and you basically have 17 divisions and 4 prime sanctioning bodies, okay? Do the math. 17 times 2 is 34. 34 times 2 is 68. You have 68 champions. 68 champions in the modern era as opposed to 8 from the 1880 on, and adding to that level of havoc, you've got the relationships between the promoters and the networks. So now the money is being made, through pay-per-view and through the networks. So right now you have Fox and you have ESPN, you have Showtime, you have HBO, and these guys are signing exclusives with promoters. And the promoters have their own stable of fighters, and obviously they want to do the best that they can to create fights between fighters within their own stables, because that means that the promotional money and the network money goes to one promoter. So now the cross divisional, cross promotional, cross network fights become much more complicated, and they become less lucrative for the individual sanctioning bodies and for the promoters. So it becomes an absolute mess. Okay. So my point is that these discussions you see today that a lot of you guys are engaging in, it's not the norm. It's dysfunctional. It's a mess. This isn't the way the game is supposed to operate. Like I said, you look at the MMA. MMA, you got a champ. You know, you got a monopoly for the most part. You got one guy, pretty much. I mean, you got your Bellators and your others, but everybody knows the best fighters are in the UFC. And Dana White is running the show. He's the matchmaker. He's the promoter. He's the whole deal. But at least you got the best fighters fighting the best fighters. And you know what? You wind up in a situation there is if you lose a fight, your career isn't over. Now the big thing with boxing is in these divisions, you know, everybody's looking to protect their guys. Everybody, you get an egg on your record, and you're basically a shot fighter today. You know, like I hear a lot of guys, hey, the argument I hear on some of these boards about Lomachenko, I keep bringing up Lomachenko, I can't help it, I'm sorry. Anyway, he lost 2 fights. Well, the guy fought excuse my French, but the guy fought, he's fought, 18 times, 16 of them were championship fights, fighting championship fights out of the belt, right out of the gate. I mean, come on, it gets, the discussions get really, really ridiculous, okay? So you got to understand that what you see happening today is dysfunctional, and a lot of the discussions are dysfunctional about who the best guys are, and that's why you have to have some knowledge of the game. I'm listening to guys. Well, he didn't fight him, and he ducked him, and this promoter isn't promoting that guy. Hey, you got to look at the fighter. That's what you got to do today. If you want to figure out who the best is, you got to look at the fighter, and you got to know something about the fight game, which means you got to be able to look at a fighter. The eye test. You got to be able to look at him and say, what does this guy bring to the table? What kind of speed? What kind of power does he have? What kind of stamina does he have? What kind of heart does he have? Can he take a punch? Can he get off the deck? You got to ask all these questions when you're assessing who the best is. All this BS about the promoters and this guy's not fighting that guy. Listen, it is what it is. But if you want to cut through all that, you got to have some knowledge about what makes a great fighter, and you got to be able to assess the talent. Unfortunate, but that's the way it rolls today in the game, and I don't see it changing because money is going to rule all in the end. You know how that works. Now, I want to clarify something about the old days, because I'm old school, so I look back and I say the old school, fighters. I like to do a tape on the old school fighters, the guys from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and compare them to the modern guys, because I think there's also a lot of confusion about what those guys brought to the table and how they'd fare today in the modern game. That's going to be the next video I do. But listen, this is the way things go. Things progress. Things evolve. There's no doubt about it. So you can extrapolate this to society, to civil rights, to everything that's going on in the country. Where you have this level of progress, where you have great evils that are absolutely tackled and still in the process of tackling, but where there's progress. But what you see happen too much is you have the baby being thrown out with the bathwater in just about everything where progress takes place, and it's no different in the fight game. Okay. In the fight game, I had mentioned in the pre-modern era, and to a large extent to, when you got into the 20s, 30s, and 40s, in that heavyweight division, you had black fighters who just, it's a great black fighters who never fought for the title. Harry Willis, Sam McVeigh, Josephson, I think his name was, don't remember, Sam Langford. These guys were great fighters who never got a chance at the title because of the color of their skin. Now, in the lighter divisions, it was a lot different. But there was not equal ground, there's no doubt about it. But the fact of the matter is, you could go back and you could look at, again, this is another video, the whole thing about the black fighters and white fighters and whatnot in the history of the sport. But you had some tremendous fighters black fighters in the lighter weight class. Were they treated equally? No. Did they get to fight the best of the best? And did they win titles? Absolutely. Were a lot of them forced to take dives in fights? Absolutely. Did some of them never get chance at the title? Absolutely. Did some of them have to fight an exorbitant number of fights to get a shot at the title? No doubt about it. But the fact is, if you look back in the history books, you go back as early as 1900 and Joe Gans. Tremendous fighter, one of the greatest lightweights. You talk about the greatest lightweights ever. You're going to hear about Roberto Duran. You're going to hear about Benny Leonard. But you're not going to hear about Joe Gans. Joe Gans was tremendous fighter. Champion, I believe, 1901. So, and I could go on and on with with names of guys in the lighter weight divisions, leading all the way up into the modern era, who were just tremendous, tremendous fighters. Bo Jack, Ike Williams, Sandy Sadler, Emil Griffith. The names just go on and on about these great fighters. But again, it was not a level playing field. So you had the purity of the 8 divisions. You had some kind of consensus on who the champion was, but you definitely had a racial wall in boxing that was absolutely disgraceful. Same thing in baseball, same thing in football, same thing in basketball. So now you've got that situation has been flipped on its head. But now we threw away the purity of the game in terms of what a world champion really is. What a champ really is. So here's my bottom line. I try to keep things in perspective. I try not to be, I believe in the old school, way of things, but I'm not pig-headed, and I recognize the reality. But today, my young boxing fans, a lot of you guys are really, really confused, and you're missing the point. And here's the problem. You want to comment on it, go ahead. But I think a lot of you guys don't know the fight game. When I say the fight game, I'm not talking about who's, what's Bob Arum doing? What's this guy doing? The WBC is doing this and the WBA is doing. That's not the fight game. The fight game is 2 guys getting in the ring, throwing, squaring off and throwing. Okay? That's what the fight game is. And you got to be able to assess the talent to be able to say, listen, this guy, boxing is messed up, but you know what? This guy's the best guy. And you got to be able to make a case for it. You got to make a legitimate case for it. And I don't see that happening today. I see a lot of nonsense. Now you got what's his name again? That guy. And you know what? It's just I'm looking at the whole situation now with Bob Arum. Bob Arum's a racist and blah blah blah. And it's turned into with Crawford. And I love Crawford. I think Crawford's #1 guy in the world. So you talk about looking at the fighters. That's what I do. I look at the fighters. Crawford's the best fighter in the world as far as I'm concerned. But now all this nonsense being injected about, you got guys out there saying that Bob Arum likes the Latin fighters and the white fighters and doesn't like the black fighters, and it's like all of a sudden the whites and the Latins are lumped together. It's freaking crazy. It's an absolute mess. Okay, so my point is, you want to talk about fighting, know the fight game. When I say know the fight game, understand what makes a great fighter, the qualities that go into a great fighter, and then you got to have the eyes to be able to assess the talent. And that's missing today in the boxing forum community. Okay, so you young guys got to wisen up, learn a little bit of history, learn a little bit about what it takes to be a great fighter. Then you can come back and you can talk intelligently about what's going on in the fight game. Anyway, that's my take. Okay, as usual, you got a bone to pick with it. Put your comments down there. I probably comment on comments more than anybody out there on the boxing forums. I probably do it more than I should. I get into that rabbit hole with some of you guys. But hey, look, I'm a fighter. I've always been a fighter. All right. And if I disagree with you, I'm going to go out. Of course, we want to go out. We want to be civilized as we possibly can be. But I'm interested in your comments. More than that, I'm interested in you living a good life and having good success in your life, having health in your family, because that's the most important thing. Boxing, all this other stuff this is all stuff to keep us occupied. But we got to make sure that we keep our eye on the prize. And to me, that's the big man upstairs that's living a good, decent life, that's treating people with respect and love and compassion, and getting away from all this nonsense that's splitting us apart. These stupid, like the color of your skin, your affiliation with the political party. This stuff is insane. It's all distraction to take us away because other people want to get over on you, and they're getting over like a fat rat. I'll tell you that right now, because we're fighting each other. All right. So peace, love. Great talking to you today. Again, leave your comments. Old school saying here. Take care.